All right, tell me about the new economic numbers that just came out, which were kind of disastrous.
Yeah, pretty stunning shock report here on our nation's GDP. GDP report shows the U.S. economy shrank. Now, the New York Times framing is masking a broader recovery. That part is a little bit up for debate. But what they say is that the U.S. economy contracted in the first 3 months of the year. GDP adjusted for inflation declined 0.4% in the first quarter. That's 1.4% on an annualized basis. That was sharply down from the 1.7% growth, which would be almost 7% annualized in the final 3 months of 2021, and was the weakest quarter since the early days of the pandemic. What they're pointing to that caused this, and by the way, economists were not expecting this. They were expecting there to be relatively slow GDP growth and certainly slower than in the last quarter of last year, but they did not expect it to actually shrink. And what they're saying is that you had a contraction of inventories and also you had more imports being brought in, so less being created domestically and more higher imports. The inventories thing is kind of interesting because this speaks to how broken the supply chain has ultimately been.
Yeah, isn't China in a lockdown or certain parts of China are in a lockdown?
Yeah, Shanghai is in a lockdown.
So shouldn't that mean
they're talking about Beijing as well?
Shouldn't that mean imports are down?
Yeah, but I guess the idea is that people have consumer spending once again increased. So just as people are spending more money, we don't make anything here. So if they're going to spend more money, it's going to come from overseas, even with, China, parts of China being locked down. That's the idea.
Okay.
The inventories thing is really interesting because so initially you had a problem where obviously, it was an issue just getting your goods and shipping was all screwed up. It continues to be, by the way. And so wholesalers stocked up, like they bought more than what they thought they ultimately needed so that they would have more in reserve since it was harder to get the things that they, wanted to then be able to resell. So they built up extra inventory and now they're sort of sitting on that inventory, not replenishing because they purchased more than they ultimately needed. So that's the part where they're saying, because inventories declined, that contributes to this fall in GDP growth or actually going backwards in terms of GDP growth, contraction. And even though you did have consumer spending tick up 0.7% in the first quarter.
So does interest rates play into this at all?
Potentially. Yes. Federal Reserve has raised interest rates only 1/4 point at this point. But so not, they haven't done a lot in terms of their policy yet. But they have signaled, obviously, that they're going to do a lot more, not just in terms of raising interest rates, potentially half percentage point next time, or even maybe 0.75% next time, but also offloading assets on their balance sheet. All of that just slows the economy down. I mean, that's the whole goal there is to slow down demand and for people to buy less stuff to try to tackle inflation. So could be potentially starting to play into it, but since they haven't done a lot yet, I don't know how much that's a factor.
Because I've heard for a long time that as soon as those interest rates start ticking up, then you're going to have all these other issues that pop up in the economy. That's something that I've read a number of times. Look, I can't tell what is and isn't political at this point when I read, like you said, the New York Times headline.
How they frame it?
Yes, read it again for everybody.
GDP report shows the U.S. economy shrank, masking a broader recovery.
Yeah,
it felt like propaganda to me.
See, that's what I'm saying is so if you had the exact same set of economic circumstances under Donald Trump, would that have been the headline?
I seriously doubt it.
Yeah, masking a broader economic recovery when there's a contraction of the economy. I've never heard a contraction described that way. In fact, I've heard slow job growth numbers viewed as the hair on fire. We only gained 200,000 jobs. We're supposed to gain 800,000. Now there's an actual contraction and they're broader recovery, bro.
Yeah.
So I don't know. This is why it's so frustrating in today's current environment. And I've been following politics for a long time. I've been doing my show since 2012, full time, and I've never trusted information less than I do now. Where I go to read stuff about something I'm covering, and I'm I think this is correct, but the fuck do I know?
Right. Well, I don't know how you can say masking a broader recovery when you know that inflation is way higher than wage growth is. So people are getting a pay cut every single month.
Right. They just pretend that's not happening.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wages went up X%. It's inflation was up more than that.
Exactly. So people are getting a pay cut every single month. And every single month, it's harder to put food on the table, gas in the car, and make rent. And they're saying, like, actually, you just don't know it. You just don't get it. But actually, things are really great. And this is I see this a lot from, I don't know if you see this from liberals on Twitter a lot, of like, the media is not even telling the story of how great the economy really is and the Biden recovery. And Democrats are trying to sell, like, you don't really get that actually your life is great and we're responsible for that. So just, like, let us tell you which figures you should actually pay attention to. And so that's a little far afield from this particular report and what's going on with GDP, but it speaks more broadly to just the question of how is the economy doing for regular people in a way that matters.
It always drives me crazy, and this happens under Republicans and it happens under Democrats, when they use the traditional economic indicators as, like, all the evidence you need as to the state of the economy, where they're like, unemployment ticked down, and it's like, well, hold on. You're using the regular unemployment rate. The real unemployment rate is what's called, it's either the U6 or the U7 unemployment rate. And usually it's about double whatever the official unemployment rate is, because the way they do it, they, like, rig the numbers and make it mask what the actual unemployed number is. And so when people use that, when people use how the stock market is doing, it's like, that's not, you're not giving me indicators of how your average American is really doing. And so when they go all in on the marketing of those things, it's like, and it happened under Trump, it happened under Biden, like, it's so misleading, almost on purpose. Like, I have to imagine that they know those are not the best economic indicators. You know, that when you look at, everybody knows the facts that I brought up 1,000 times over, but even pre-pandemic, there was one survey that showed 78% of Americans were living paycheck to paycheck. The economic data shows that a little over half of Americans make $30,000 a year or less. And you look at credit card debt through the roof, student loan debt through the roof. You look at all these things, which are a better indicator of how people are doing, and nobody says anything about that. So to bring it back into the new numbers here, look, I don't know. Could the big one be coming? Could the big crash be coming? Because at some point, something's got to give, because there's so many things that are a giant house of cards. You look at the commercial real estate bubble. You look at the regular real estate bubble. You look at, like you said, wages are actually technically being reduced every month because of inflation. At some point, something's got to give, right?
It's also the Federal Reserve. And
well, are they out of tricks?
Well, we talked to David Dayen for Breaking Point.
He's great.
About the new numbers. And he also had a longer piece about where are we in the supply chain crisis? Are things getting better? Are they getting worse? How's inflation? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? Because there are conflicting indicators in that regard. And I thought he made a really good point, which is that, look, the Fed is lifting rates, which, is very likely to trigger a recession ultimately, because they're trying to get inflation under control. Well, when you lift interest rates, what you're doing is you're trying to tamp down demand so that people have less money and buy less stuff. That's what you're trying to do.
Right, you're incentivizing saving.
Yeah, you're trying to tamp down demand. And he said the problem isn't demand, though. The problem is on the supply side. The problem is this broken supply chain.
Right.
So how does the Fed raising interest rates to curb demand deal with the supply chain issues? It doesn't. And honestly, I could blame the Fed for a number of things, but the reality is they have a limited set of tools and instruments at their disposal. They're very blunt instruments. It's very difficult to tell how much they've kicked in and how much of an effect they've had because there's a significant lag. And so they're using the incredibly blunt instruments that they have at their disposal. What you really need is a functioning government and legislative branch and presidency to be able to deal with these broader supply chain issues rather than just relying on the Fed for everything. So, that's really the bigger problem here. Do I think that we're likely to tip into recession? I think it is very possible. And, some of the key indicators that have in the past come just before a recession are there and are in place. You have an increasing number of economists saying they expect recession because you do have the Fed not only starting to lift rates, but indicating they're going to do so more aggressively. Even the so-called dovish members of the Fed saying, we're going to move forward with much more aggressive measures and offload the assets on our balance sheet at a much more rapid clip. And because you have inflation numbers still coming in at very, very high numbers, that also increases the expectation that they're going to move aggressively. And so, yeah, I think it's a very, very dangerous landscape right now.
This is the problem with globalization. And this is the problem with the so-called free market. And actually, Chomsky makes this point, that when Adam Smith was talked about the invisible hand of the market, it's actually totally misinterpreted by conservatives. And the idea is like, oh, it just, stuff's going to get where it needs to go because that's the way the market works. No, the point, apparently, according to Chomsky, was as if there was an invisible hand, you wouldn't have companies basically outsource their jobs overseas because of language barriers and travel issues and things of that nature. So basically, like, we'll have protectionism even if you open up the marketplace, because basically there'll be an invisible hand that makes it so that the business owners want to keep the stuff here. That's kind of the idea, again, according to Noam Chomsky. But when you look at what's happening with the supply chain crisis, you understand how bad of a rap so-called protectionism really got all along. Because the whole idea was, like, the default setting was, why should we facilitate the laws or even incentivize business owners to outsource all these jobs and then make this stuff overseas? And then if there's a disruption in the supply chain, we could just be asked out on a number of things that we need in this country.
Yeah.
That we have the potential to make here. We have the potential to have the factories here and the jobs here and create it here, so on and so forth. But they just, to make an extra buck, they decided, let's outsource it. Now, I'm not saying you can't do any trade overseas at all. Of course not. But anything we can make here, we should make here.
Yeah.
And the laws should be, structured in a way where there's a premium for American goods, where you're incentivized more to keep the jobs here. You get the tax breaks, you get the subsidies or whatever, you keep the jobs here. You penalize the outsourcers. Okay, you want to do it? Well, you got to pay an extra tax. That's what a tariff is. A tariff is, okay, if you're going to do that, we're going to charge you more on it. Usually it has to do with other countries, though. That's more of what the tariff is.
Well, here's the other thing, because there's a couple pieces here. Number one, what you're pointing to is the fact that because of this neoliberal ideology, and because the only value was like, let's make the extra buck, that has fed outsourcing. It's made the supply chain extremely fragile.
Right.
And it's not just about outsourcing. It's also about things like the amount of inventory that's held here, because there's a cost to holding inventory.
Right. That's a great point.
So it's also the move to just-in-time production, where everything has to move completely perfectly and seamlessly, and all of these 1,000 different pieces that are involved have to be clicking optimally, or else you ultimately end up with these massive issues. And so that's what we're really reckoning with right now, is that we built in no resiliency, because resiliency costs a little bit of money.
Yep.
And we didn't have any value other than just profit margins. And the promise to consumers, that the bargain that was made, is you'll get lower prices. But now we have inflation because of that lack of resiliency that is even giving lie to the idea that you were going to get lower prices. So that's basically the system that we've ultimately set up. And then you also, of course, have the fact that the trade regime that we've constructed has led to, in large part, a sort of global race to the bottom in terms of labor costs and labor standards.
Yeah.
And it did not have to be that way.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the thing is, and this is, something Bernie talks about is, we're not against trade with other nations, but what we've created is a trade system that was designed by, sort of corporate sociopaths who had no interest in any sort of lifting of wage and labor standards globally. And so instead of creating a sort of race to the top, you've had a race to the bottom that has been devastating for American workers, and it's been devastating for workers abroad as well.
Well, you remember all the reporting on TPP when they were negotiating that, how they had it like under lock and key, and even Congress people weren't allowed to see it. And it was like, so who's really making the decisions when it comes to these deals? Who's really making the decisions? It's not the workers.
I remember, I think it was the Washington Post, I want to give them credit, it's before they were owned by Bezos, little side note. They broke down all of the interest groups and people who were involved in the TPP negotiations by like industry. And there was like tiny little number of people associated with labor, and like thousands that were from pharma and oil and gas, and every industry under the sun, massive representation. I mean, it was a completely corporate written bill with like one unionist in the country who was like, maybe we should think about the workers. And they're like, shut up. We don't care. Move on.
Yeah. Yeah. You made a couple great points there. It really becomes nefarious when you think of the way the supply chain is now, particularly when it comes to medical supplies,
Yeah,
it's like,
it's an obvious case.
During a pandemic, and you're telling me like all of our stuff comes from China, and now we can't get as much of it as we need.
Right.
That should have been the moment where everybody looked at each other and went, oh, we fucked up with this globalization thing. We have to start building more here.
Right.
We need more jobs here. We need more factories here. We need more industries here. We need to incentivize by any means necessary. And actually, to their credit, I don't know how directly Biden was involved with these negotiations, but now you have the electric car factory or electric car battery factory and the semiconductor factory, the microchip factory that's now coming to, I think it was Ohio or Michigan, or I think there's one or two factories in each. Yeah. So now that's a good start. But we should usher in a whole new era of this sort of stuff. And the idea that you want to, hey, let's cut back on costs so we can pad that profit margin a little more, hire some, 13-year-old Malaysian boy or something, or Bangladeshi kid. No, we got to be done with that. We see the impact now that we didn't manufacture here all along. It wasn't pretty. It was really ugly.
Yeah, and Mr. So-called, anti-China and anti-globalist Trump was, of course, at the helm when the pandemic breaks out. And so there was a chance to use that moment in order to message about, hey, we got to change our trade practices. I mean, if he actually cared about any of these issues, which, of course, we all know that he doesn't, now is the time to message the American people about why this ultimately matters and why we need to rebalance things. Of course, that did not happen.
His biggest legislative accomplishment, the 2017 tax cuts, where 83% of the benefits went to the wealthy. In that bill, they actually incentivized outsourcing of jobs.
Right. That single fact alone tells you absolutely everything. And the other thing that I'll add into this, because you mentioned the electric vehicles, which is really important if you care about, the future of the planet and the climate crisis, is because we haven't had any sort of a forward-thinking policy and any value of anything except for making money. We're also in a very difficult position in terms of securing the ability to manufacture those electric vehicle batteries and the cars themselves and the chip crisis and all of those things. So there are a million obvious indicators that the whole direction we've gone in has been a disaster on every single level. And yet the policy response is like, let's hope the Fed can fix it somehow. Anyway, actually, the economy's great, and you're just wrong, and you don't know. Moving along.
Yeah. All right. Well, on that note, why don't we go ahead and welcome the lovely and brilliant and wonderful Marianne Williamson. Here she is.